The interview started before Peter even knew he was being interviewed. Not when he entered the meeting room, not when the manager asked the first question, not even when he shook someone's hand. It had already begun with one ordinary conversation that Peter believed meant nothing. By the time he finally sat across from the hiring manager, someone had already formed a first impression of him. And that impression almost cost him the opportunity he had spent months preparing for. If you've ever practiced interview questions, waited for the perfect moment to apply, or told yourself, "I'll do it when I'm ready," then stay with us. Because this story is not really about interviews. It is about the moments that quietly decide our future before we even realize they matter. Peter wasn't the smartest employee in the company, and he certainly wasn't the loudest. While others loved sharing ideas in meetings, Peter preferred listening first. He believed actions spoke louder than words. If a difficult task had to be finished before a deadline, people trusted Peter without hesitation. He was dependable, honest, and hardworking. His manager often joked, "If Peter says he'll take care of it, you can stop worrying." Hearing those words always made him proud. Yet deep inside, Peter carried a habit that quietly held him back. He believed successful people felt ready before taking big opportunities, ready for interviews, ready for promotions, ready for leadership, ready for life itself. So whenever a new opportunity appeared, he gave himself the same answer. "Maybe next time. I need a little more experience. Just a few more weeks." He wasn't afraid of working hard. He was afraid of beginning before he felt completely prepared. Every evening after work, while most of his colleagues hurried home, Peter stayed behind. The office became quieter as the sun slowly disappeared outside the windows. His desk was covered with notebooks, printed articles, and colorful sticky notes filled with ideas. He spent hours reading about leadership, communication, marketing strategies, and public speaking. He highlighted important sentences, rewrote his notes, and practiced explaining ideas in simple words. Every day he learned something new. Every week he became a little better, but something strange happened along the way. The more knowledge he gained, the more he noticed everything he still didn't know. Every answer seemed to create two new questions. Have you ever felt that? The closer you get to your goal, the farther away it suddenly seems. Peter felt trapped in that cycle. He wasn't preparing anymore. He was hiding behind preparation. Then on a quiet Monday morning, an email appeared in his inbox. The subject line read, "Internal hiring opportunity, marketing team leader." Peter's eyes stopped moving. His heart didn't. It immediately began racing. This was the position he had dreamed about for almost a year. Better pay, more responsibility, a chance to finally lead projects instead of simply following instructions. His hand moved toward the apply button, then stopped. That familiar voice inside his head returned. "Not yet. You only get one chance. Prepare a little more." Instead of submitting his application immediately, Peter opened another notebook. He started writing possible interview questions. He searched for leadership advice online. He watched interview videos during lunch breaks. Every evening he stood in front of the mirror, practicing answers that sounded smarter each time he repeated them. Whenever one answer felt good enough, he found another sentence he wanted to improve. Another example he wanted to remember. Another story that sounded more impressive. Days quietly became weeks. His notebook became thicker. His confidence did not. Finally, the interview day arrived. Peter woke up nearly an hour earlier than usual. He ironed his shirt one last time, polished his shoes until they reflected the morning light, and checked his documents again and again. Resume, portfolio, notebook, pen, everything was exactly where it should be. Before leaving home, he looked at himself in the mirror and whispered softly, "You've prepared for this. but somehow the person looking back didn't seem convinced. He reached the company's headquarters almost 30 minutes early. The building was already full of activity. Employees walked through the glass entrance carrying laptops and coffee cups. Some laughed together while others rushed toward morning meetings. It looked like an ordinary workday. Only Peter felt different. His stomach was tight. His palms felt unusually cold. He walked to the reception desk, forcing a polite smile. "Good morning," the receptionist said warmly. "You're here early." Peter smiled back. "I wanted a little extra time before the interview." "That's never a bad idea," she replied with a friendly smile. "Please have a seat. The hiring manager is finishing another meeting." Peter thanked her and sat down in the waiting area. He opened his notebook one final time. Leadership principles, marketing ideas, interview questions. Every lesson he had collected over the past few months was right there in front of him. He took a slow, careful breath and told himself, "Just a few more minutes, then the interview begins." What Peter didn't know was that the interview had already started. Peter looked around the waiting area. It was quiet except for the soft sound of keyboards and distant conversations behind the glass walls. He closed his notebook for a moment and checked the time. 23 minutes left. Good, he thought. I can review everything one more time. Just then, another man walked into the reception area. He looked about the same age as Peter and wore a navy blue suit. He smiled politely before taking the seat beside him. "Marketing team leader interview?" he asked. Peter nodded with a nervous smile. "You too?" The man laughed softly. "Yes, I think we're competitors for the next hour." Peter smiled back, but inside his heart beat a little faster. The competition suddenly felt real. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Peter tried reading his notes again, but the words no longer stayed in his mind. Finally, the other candidate broke the silence. "I've always wondered why interviews make people so nervous," he said with a friendly smile. "After all, they're just conversations." Peter gave a small laugh. "Maybe for you," he replied. "For me, it feels like every word decides my future." The man nodded thoughtfully. "That's understandable." Peter sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Honestly, I don't even know why companies ask so many questions. Most people just memorize answers from the internet anyway." The other candidate smiled politely but didn't respond. Peter continued without thinking. "I've been preparing for weeks. If they ask something unexpected, all that preparation could become useless." He shook his head and laughed quietly. "Sometimes I think interviews only test who can pretend to be confident." At that moment, the receptionist walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Would either of you like some?" she asked warmly. Peter looked at his notebook, then at the coffee. "No, thank you," he answered quickly. "I'd rather keep studying." The other candidate smiled. "I'd love one, thank you." The receptionist placed the cup on the table. As she turned to leave, the man beside Peter stood up and quietly helped her pick up a pen she had accidentally dropped. "Here you go," he said with a smile. "Thank you," she replied gratefully before returning to her desk. Peter barely noticed. His attention was fixed on the next page of interview questions. A few minutes later, an elderly man entered the reception area carrying several heavy folders. As he reached for the elevator button, one folder slipped from his hands. Papers scattered across the polished floor. Peter looked up for a second. His first thought was, someone should help him. His second thought was, I can't lose my focus now. Before he could decide, the other candidate was already kneeling on the floor, carefully collecting the papers. "No rush," he said kindly. "We've got time." The older man smiled with relief. "Thank you, young man, I appreciate it." Peter looked back at his notebook. For some reason, he suddenly found it difficult to concentrate. Only a few minutes remained before the scheduled interview. Peter silently repeated his opening introduction one last time. His voice was barely above a whisper. He wanted every sentence to sound perfect. Then the receptionist looked toward the hallway and smiled. "Good morning, Miss Emily." Peter looked up. A confident woman in a gray suit walked toward them with calm, steady steps. She greeted the receptionist by name before turning toward the waiting area. The man beside Peter stood immediately. "Good morning," he said with a friendly smile. She smiled back. "Good morning. Thank you for helping Mr. Harris with those documents earlier." Peter frowned slightly. She had noticed that. Then she turned toward him. "And you must be Peter." He quickly stood up. "Yes, good morning." Emily shook his hand warmly. "I've heard a little about both of you already." Peter smiled politely, assuming she meant their resumes. Then Emily glanced at the receptionist with a knowing smile before looking back at the candidates. "I always like hearing first impressions before I begin an interview," she said casually. "Sometimes they tell me things that a resume never can." Peter felt his stomach tighten. His mind instantly replayed every word he had spoken in the waiting area, every complaint, every excuse, every impatient comment about interviews, every moment he had ignored the people around him. None of those things had seemed important just a few minutes ago. Now they felt impossible to forget. Emily opened the meeting room door and smiled. "Shall we begin?" Peter looked down at the notebook in his hands. For weeks he had been preparing answers for interview questions. But not once had he prepared for the interview that had already happened outside the room. He closed the notebook slowly, took a deep breath, and walked through the door, realizing that opportunities often begin long before we think they do. The interview room was surprisingly simple. A large window overlooked the city. A round table stood in the middle, with 3 chairs neatly arranged around it. Emily invited Peter to sit down before taking the seat across from him. She didn't open his resume immediately. She simply smiled and asked, "So, Peter, how has your morning been?" It was such an ordinary question, yet it caught him completely off guard. A few minutes earlier he would have answered, "Stressful." He would have complained about interviews and how nervous he felt. But now, after realizing that every small moment mattered, he paused before speaking. "Honestly," he said with a gentle smile, "it's been educational." Emily raised an eyebrow with curiosity. "Educational," Peter nodded. "I came here thinking the interview would begin when I entered this room. I don't think I believe that anymore." Emily smiled, but she didn't explain why. Instead, she asked her first official question. "If I asked the people you work with to describe you in one sentence, what do you think they would say?" Peter had prepared dozens of impressive answers for leadership questions, but not this one. There was no perfect sentence waiting inside his notebook. He thought quietly for a moment before answering. "I hope they would say I'm someone they can trust. I don't always have the smartest idea, and I'm still learning every day. But if I promise to do something, I make sure it's finished." Emily nodded without writing anything down. She simply listened. Peter noticed something interesting. She wasn't looking for perfect words. She was listening for honest ones. The next questions came naturally. "Tell me about a mistake that changed you." "Describe a time you disagreed with someone at work." "What kind of leader do you want to become?" Peter stopped searching for perfect answers. Instead, he told real stories. He spoke about missing a deadline early in his career because he was afraid to ask for help. He admitted that he sometimes spent too much time trying to make things perfect instead of simply starting. He laughed at himself when he remembered practicing speeches alone in front of the bathroom mirror. The room felt different now. It no longer felt like an examination. It felt like two people having an honest conversation. Toward the end of the interview, Emily closed the folder that contained Peter's resume. "I'd like to ask one final question," she said. Peter nodded. "Imagine you don't get this position today. What will you do tomorrow?" Peter smiled softly. A few hours ago, that question would have frightened him. Now it felt surprisingly simple. "Tomorrow," he replied, "I'll come back to work. I'll keep learning. I'll keep improving. And when another opportunity comes, I won't spend months waiting to feel ready. Because I've realized something today." Emily leaned forward slightly. "And what's that?" Peter took a slow breath before answering. "Readiness isn't something that suddenly appears one morning. It's something we build by showing up, even while we're still uncertain." For the first time during the interview, Emily smiled broadly. "That's a good lesson," she said. Then she stood up and walked with Peter toward the door. As they reached the reception area, she stopped beside the receptionist. "Thank you, Sarah," she said warmly. Sarah smiled back. "Of course." Emily turned toward Peter. "Do you know why I introduced you to Sarah before the interview?" Peter shook his head. Emily continued, "Because she's usually the first person every candidate meets. After every interview day, I ask her one simple question." Peter looked surprised. "What question?" Emily smiled. "How did they treat you when they thought no one important was watching?" Peter stood silently. Suddenly, every moment from the waiting room became clear. The small conversation with the other candidate, the complaint about interviews, the elderly man dropping his papers, the receptionist offering coffee. None of those moments had been random. They had quietly revealed the person behind the resume. Emily looked at him kindly. "Technical skills can be taught. Experience comes with time. But respect, patience, humility, and kindness usually appear long before the interview begins." Peter lowered his eyes for a moment. He realized he had spent weeks polishing answers while forgetting something much more important. Interviews don't simply measure what you know. They often reveal who you already are. Peter walked out of the building feeling lighter than when he had entered. He didn't know whether he had earned the promotion. Strangely, it didn't matter as much anymore. What mattered was the lesson he was taking home. For months, he had been waiting for confidence to arrive before taking the next step. But confidence had never been the starting point. Action was. The moment he stopped trying to sound impressive and simply became himself, the fear slowly lost its power. Maybe that's true for more than interviews. Maybe our biggest opportunities begin quietly, long before we notice them, in the way we speak to strangers, in the way we react when plans suddenly change, in the choices we make when nobody seems to be paying attention. Because character is rarely built during important moments. It is revealed by the ordinary ones. Now we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever realized that an opportunity had already begun before you expected it? Or have you ever learned an important lesson from a moment you almost ignored? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might encourage someone else who is waiting for the perfect time to begin. Thank you for spending these few minutes improving your English with us through stories that stay with you long after they end. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to subscribe and join our growing community of English learners from around the world. Until our next story, keep learning, keep growing, and remember, sometimes the biggest moments in life begin long before we realize they've started.